Good evening, everyone. My name is Jing. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at SMU. I'm also leading the Urban Growth Pillar at the Urban Institute at SMU. Very happy to have this opportunity tonight to host this panel discussion. I guess today we're going to sit together to talk about this Industry Connect event with a focus on redefining urban living in Singapore. Okay, so the focus today, as mentioned earlier, is the concept of live, work, play, and learn. So this is like very simple for concepts, but critically and comprehensively summarizes the urban landscape that we see nowadays. Okay, so before we dive into these simple concepts, maybe we begin with a round of self-introduction by our panelists again. Just let them to introduce a bit more of their background and how they can connect better with the audience today. We start with Joel.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Joel, and as all of you saw from the screen, I graduated in 2010. So no, no prizes for what my age is. For me, I've been in real estate pretty much since from graduation. So for me, I've actually gone through pretty much all the developers that most of you will be familiar with: Mapletree, Lendlease, Far East, and then currently now CDL. So I think for me, I've seen quite a lot of different sectors. Whether it's industrial, whether it's office, retail. And so I think it's been a very meaningful journey. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to our discussion tonight.
Nai Jia, please.
Hi, I'm Nai Jia. I'm head of the Real Estate Intelligence Unit. So I actually was not an alum of SMU. Plead guilty first. But over my years, I did quite a fair bit of research in the academia in NUS, and then of course went to MIT and then came back as a faculty member. Then after that, I went to the private sector, which is they say the fun part, and then I work in consultancy. So very, very interestingly, when we think about today's topic about work, live, learn, play, we have seen it, how it evolved, how it was first thought about from different theories. So it's really very exciting and very happy to be here together with new friends here and of course my colleagues to share some of the things that we found in our data. Thanks.
Thank you.
So, hi, my name is Aidan Wong. I am Assistant Professor of Urban Studies. My main focus is on urban economic development, specifically looking at urban waste management. So I'm the garbage and rubbish man. But I'm also the person who is driving our behaviors, the recycling behaviors in Singapore, especially the studies around that. And of course, one of the things which most of you are having to deal with, which is particularly circular economy stuff. But in terms of my contribution at this discussion, I don't know how I ended up on this side. I was supposed to be that position as the question asker. I ended up as a panelist instead. And it's probably because I'm also the coordinator for Singapore Studies. And I only just recently stepped down as the coordinator across all our universities for Singapore Studies across all the autonomous universities. So we coordinate the way in which citizenship studies is facilitated. So nice to join you all this evening.
Thank you. Thanks to Aidan, Nai Jia, and Joel. Very warm welcome, okay, to SMU. All right, so back to today's topic. Again, it's on the theme of live, work, play, and learn, right? As you can see from the title, I'm an economist. So when I see these four words, I turn to map it back into the economic framework that I'm familiar with myself. I believe also familiar to some of you as well. So when we think about these four themes, typically we would like to categorize them into two broad categories, what we call consumption and production. Okay. For example, when we think about learn and work, we use them to represent, engines of economic growth and value creation. And those activities tend to happen within cities, urban areas. Okay, why? Because urban cities, they provide a very nice environment for us to develop our skills and knowledge via channels like what we have right now. Okay, and on the other hand, when we think about consumption, This explains why people would like to live and play within cities, because here you get to enjoy all the amenities and experiences that only city can offer. And these are the kind of the things that, enrich your life and create, provide relaxation and enjoyment. Okay. So if you think about those topics map into those two broad categories, then at least I feel it's helpful to provide a benchmark for us to develop our conversations for tonight. Okay. So along those lines, then here comes my first question. Okay. So for all the panelists here, can you please share your experiences and perspectives on what Singapore used to be like in terms of living and working? Okay. And how has it transformed over the years to become what we observe nowadays? Okay. Anyone who feels like to go first, feel free.
I'll start off first, but I promise this will not sound like a lecture. One of the things which we really need to start our minds with when we look at live, work, play, and learn. First of all, I totally agree with the parsimony which Jing has started us off with, which is about the production and consumption. But even this separation itself bears within it the potentials for confusion. Exactly because even in situations of consumption, you still need to have the producers around it. And in situations of production, you need to have a consumer for it, right? It's a perennial question which we've always grappled with as a very small economy, and one which has had to orient itself in understanding how we can expand, particularly our consumption economy. Our consumption economy specifically, we are a powerhouse in production, but we need to figure that out. But historically, if we were to look backward in time, where did we start off with when we started the urbanization journey, the urbanization and industrialization journey itself? We remember that in the periods of 1959, now we look into after National Day, certain patriotic pride coming out. You start looking at the emergence of a situation where we needed to increase female workforce participation. What was the immediate urbanization transformation which emerged from that? Flatted factories in our HDB estates, allowing for a shorter journey to work to occur. I want you to hold on to this idea of the journey to work, because this type of emphasis on having short journey to work has animated many of the other urbanization strategies which we have undertaken, both in accelerating our movement, i.e. MRT and our bus network, our mass movements, but also another part of it, which is the pivoting away from a centralization within the CBD for most of our functions. And if we were to see many of our government functions nowadays, the state functions which you see, they are decentralized into Jurong, Tampines, Woodlands, into our major clusters. And accompanying with that, attendant with that, has been the decentralization of industry as well, seen, manifested in the form of business parks which are there. So the first thing which I would then state to you all is think through about what this journey to work means and what this translates to in terms of reconsidering this nexus of live, work, play, learn, and consumption production. Where does that leave us? I'm not going to say any more. I'm going to leave them to think through that. So over to you all.
So more questions are getting raised.
When I came across this term, right, the work, live, learn, play, it was when I was still an undergrad learning about urban planning in Singapore. So this term I came across when I was reading the next lab. I'm now in the next, I think we are in the next lab. The lab after next, I'm not sure, but yeah. So during that time, the idea of this concept was to prevent the CBD from hollowing out. So there's this concept about, oh, we don't want to be like New York, every day people hollow out, and then it become like a dead city. So that is from my urban planning background. They talk a lot about it. But from an urban economics background, right, then it's a different story where you talk about, that we map back to pricing, because that's how people will decide where they want to locate, how much they want to price it, how much space they want to stay. And usually that starts all the different thing we think about, the price gradient, all those things. And of course, over time, people change. In the past, we also wonder, does people really want to stay near where they work? because, we used to joke, if you stay too close, if your boss have anything, they were first person to call you. If there's a fire in the office, they will also call you. So those are some of the practical aspects of it, not related to economics or social aspect of it. But then over time, we see that from our data, when people search for properties, they always look at places of certain interest. So recently we did one where we look at all the different integrated developments, and people are more interested in integrated developments, have a stronger appeal. They search longer. They always use it as a first point of contact for such properties compared to those that are less integrated. So you could see that people are really engaged in that play element, the element that is needed to engage people. So at one point in time, we think that retail space will die, but after that, it seems to regenerate again. Maybe it's due to some pent-up demand during COVID, but it is really doing very well now because of the need to engage. And I think that's part maybe of the social aspect of it. Yeah, Joel.
Thanks.
Yeah, I let Aidan and Nai Jia go first because I have spoken to them before already, and I know they're very knowledgeable in terms of, just understanding history and appreciating and, the different facets of it. For me, I come a bit more from the perspective of just capital market. And I think for most of you, you will recall when the REITs really started coming up, which is about 20 years ago. In fact, about 20 years ago already, right, as we speak. And if you think about, for those who, 80s, you saw the things around you, 80s, 90s, you will remember that there are not many shopping centers, right? Well, you remember it's just Orchard Road. For those of you who don't remember, good for you, right? Means you're younger. But for us who remember, means that, there was not many options, right? But you realize in the last 20 years, right, the amount of options has quadrupled, right? And the experiences in the last 20 years have, it's not 2 times better than the previous 20, right? But many times better. And I think this is really a function of developers being able to develop and then, produce products that are in demand. And then because they are so good in producing demand, whether it's consumption, productivity, value creation, it then brings about a value creation to the product. And therefore, investors actually are interested, right? And there's a demand for real estate. And then that creates a virtuous cycle many times over. So that to me was pretty much where I come from as like the economic sense and value creation.
Okay, thanks for sharing. It's very useful, very insightful perspectives looking into the development of the transportation system, the decentralization, and how should we think of a value added to the people from both perspectives. Then following that, I guess the natural question is like, thinking about the past and then understanding there has been a lot of changes, but then today's focus is more on the future, right? So how about we start from today? So what will be still the challenges that we face nowadays? And then naturally, if you have a challenge, what would be a possible solution to deal with that, right? So I guess for solutions, we can offer some realistic solutions, thinking about the reality. At the same time, if you have the power to be, to have the freedom in the world to design the city that you want without any capacity constraints, without any resource constraint, what kind of a cities would you like to design? Something like that. I'm mindful of the timing. I'm not going to drag my question for too long. I guess I will leave this as the last question before we open up for general questions. Okay, so let's have a round of discussion around this.
I'm going to start off, and I'm very naughty in this one because it's almost like, Jing, you're asking us to think through Brasilia. Right, Brasilia and Frank Lloyd Wright, and starting on a utopia and then thinking that we're going to be suddenly able to drive the whole urban economy and make urban living and urban social life really nice and successful. But as we have seen with the issues around Brasilia, anything but predictability is the call of the day in urban living, right? And so the 3 challenges which I would actually ask us to think through more carefully is this. First was riding on Nai Jia's point. The issue is not around proximity anymore. It is about the intensity of connectivity which becomes the hallmark of what people are looking for. And as a result of that, it becomes one of an interesting question when we consider, I know my students in class, when I speak to them about the report on the Committee of the Future Economy, they asked, you mean we are building 5 airport terminals, a 5th one, seriously, in Singapore, and with a population of what, 7 million? What sense does that make, right? A lot. A lot because of the realities of inter-urban, intra-urban connectivity is central to the idea of that. That's the first one to consider. The second issue to consider, which we have, is this issue which Jing mentioned with regard, Nai Jia mentioned, with regard to the hollowing out of the CBD area. Now, contemporary issues emerge, which is we have succeeded in bringing people back into the CBD. The sale, reflections, all the different types of residential mixed use types of developments which have occurred in the CBD, in Marina Bay area. We have succeeded, broadly speaking, in bringing back life to that area. A lot more retail, a lot more F&B for things which happen after 7 o'clock, right? Even this morning, I was on the MRT and I was reading an article about Tan Sushan. Sushan goes on a run after work in Marina Bay all the way to Gardens by the Bay. That brings life and vitality into what would otherwise be a dead zone. But here comes the challenge for us. Insofar as we decide to brand ourselves as a city of light, and you know this well enough that any city worth its measure, if it goes dark, falls off the grid, literally, because it's the energy grid is what is looking at its economic vitality in many measures. If we go dark, what happens to us? Now, energy consumption is something we need to be careful about with regard to UN SDGs. But yet, we also need to think more carefully about city imaging. How do we now engage with technology to allow for us to power our light at a less carbon-intensive level and still get that same top-of-mind effect of city imaging come out? Second point. Third point I wanted to raise was this question about learning, living. And this is a very difficult issue to deal with. Even in this place which we're working at, we have how many faculty and how many staff, but then we ask ourselves, how many organizations provide for childcare services on site? And is there a possibility for learning and living to occur in a more integrated, intentional, and purposeful manner? Because for many of us, if we want to be balancing out the issues of demographic change, yet wanting to have fulfilling employment and economic lives, what does it mean for us to be able to say, my child, should I have them, will be taken care of in a childcare center which I can conveniently pick them up from and know that it's all right? Does this mean that we change the way in which we structure space in terms of the provision of these services? Or does it mean that we change the structure of how we look at employment and work locations? Should it be work which is more flexible, where it can be done that way? And of course, in December, we're going to get the rollout of the mandatory flexible employment system. But is that even the actual answer? Or do we actually need to think more carefully about how we can curate more flexible spaces in suburban areas for people to come to, rent some space, do some work, pick up their kids, run away, do other meetings? Most of the time, these are questions which have impacts thereafter on the real estate industry itself and how it structures commercial retail spaces.
But building on your point, I really like about, thinking about from living, learning, working, consuming. One of the key things that is very intriguing to me these days is really about inclusivity. Inclusivity between ages, inclusivity among people with different beliefs. So in US, of course, we see the divide, the red and the blue. Then in UK, we also see a lot of divide, and it's everywhere. So the next question is, from an urban planning point of view or from a developer point of view, we need to think beyond like just gratification of utility at this point. And from a personal point of view, one has to think about learning beyond, it's like every time there will be some new technological wave, and we need to come back to SMU and take more courses, help you to market. But in truth is, then how do we ensure this community, this good community to continue to grow, expand, and grow? And so I think that is one of the biggest challenge that I would feel. How do you have that similar views? Of course, sustainability, all these are very big issues, but if the community is very divided, then whatever problems that we are facing will not be solved, because we will be always at loggerheads arguing among each other. And that's why we talk about sustainability for so long, since I was an undergrad. So I don't tell you how old am I, but that is how long it is. And things are still not being done. And one of my colleagues' pet peeve is, I have to repeat for him, is we don't have double glazed windows. Right? And you think about this, why is that so? There's the cost part. So how do we as a community agree to pay more, agree to sacrifice everyone for the common good? So that part, I feel that is going to be harder and harder, especially with social media, which is more of like self-positioning, self-branding, becoming something that is much entrenched in our lives. So I think, of course, from a developer point of view, I would be very interested to know, because when you are looking at an asset, it is sometimes you think much further away, but you also need to have the bottom line. And I think CDL is one of the most forthright thinker when it comes to sustainability, everything. So it will be very interesting to see how do we manage all this in this very complex, volatile world.
Sorry, can I just quickly follow up? Is there a concrete solution that can be possibly offered to do something about that? It's gonna be hard.
I think the first part, right, that I know it's not a very popular policy, but the government has been doing it very consciously, is to introduce low-income housing in very exclusive estates, which is kind of a contrarian approach, right? Because people who are rich want exclusivity, and you force that in. And that seems to me one of a possible solution. And why? Now we look at Iskandar. Iskandar has immense potential. I remember when I joined the consultancy line, there's a lot of research ongoing doing there. The potential is there. Low labor costs, a lot of land, what is the potential that can be done? It's a lot. But what is missing is the bottom line for if you develop a building, right? What is the kind of properties that will give you the highest margin? It's luxury condominiums. And because of that, we realize that Iskandar do not have that workforce, because people don't stay there, the poor don't stay there, to support the underlying infrastructure.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think that will be one of the key.
It's a natural point for the developer to come in.
In fact, the good thing about being last is that you got the time to think. The bad thing is that you have a lot of things to answer after that. Actually, I think Nai Jia answered major part of the question, which is to what extent is the government involved, right, in making a lot of projects viable. But before I talk into that, let's take a step back. The reality of I think earlier on Aidan mentioned about the intensity of connectivity. Actually, that is that's quite a mouthful. How does that translate? And he gave the example, right, which was basically DBS CEO, or soon to be CEO, right, taking a run around the Marina Bay. And for those of you who have done that route, that you know how why do you like to run there, right? Because there's just so many people you see and you want to be seen, right? There's a lot of space and you have a great feeling of wellness that comes out of it. There are lots of events there, right? A lot of keynote events that are held around that area, right? Our National Day Parade will be every year sooner or later, and next month, right? Grand Prix. A lot of these, but do you see that between all the events, do you see what is that consistent thing? It is event organization. It is property management. It is curation. And it takes an entire team or many teams to get that done. And there is no better team than Team Singapore, right, who has been able to demonstrate that, right, for both global events and events closer to home, right? Now, of course, if you convert that into a commercial sense, what does that translate, right? If all of you go to your neighborhood malls and you have Mooncake Festival, you have your Chinese New Year, you have all these are essentially curated events to entice you. I bring my kids to the Paw Patrol show, right? These are all going forward, right? What ensures you can design how well you design, how well you spend your money, right? Is all for nothing if you don't have strong curation to bind the elements together, right? So then comes the next question, space, which is always the biggest question for developers. Every time we give up a space to placemake, right, it means that space is not rented out. It's a loss of income to us. It's a lower value creation from our perspective, right? And I think for us, unfortunately, developers I call ourselves we're juggling balls. That's what developers have always done and will continue to do. It's just that every year you get additional ball, whether it's sustainability ball, whether it's government has some new guideline or ABSD ball. You get all sorts of different ball. Then you just got to continue juggling. A lot of the times, right? Actually, a lot of that juggling eventuates. The more things that we have to do, will translate into very realistically lower land price, right? And that's the part where we need. And that's why it comes back to government, right? Hand in hand with developer. What's the outcome you want for your certain master plan? This is no secret. Right now, the CDL is part of a consortium that is bidding for the Jurong JLD, right? And that is going to be a very mega mixed-use development. Of course, can't share further detail, but we're still waiting, from the authorities and so on. So we leave it in their good hands. But then in the end, we have done our part. They also will need to figure out what's it going to be. And then we need to hand in hand. Now, I want to relate back to Nai Jia's point about social housing. Actually, that's very key because when you provide low social housing, essentially you are providing a subsidy on your land. You're not selling at full market value, but you are creating outcomes, right, that will last for, actually can change the face of the next generation. How would people who maybe are staying in Woodlands or Yishun or, far out, and now you have, as a child, and now you have a chance to move to Bukit Timah, right? And how does that, as a young adult, right, going to start a family or with a partner, whatever, right? Or, how does that change your life perception, right? And your journey in real estate. So I think that, notwithstanding the time we have, I think that this conversation could go a very long way. But ultimately, it is really an industry, government, it's so many people as a team effort to what outcomes we want, who is willing to put in the cost, who are you willing to accept a lower land price? Everyone's got to give in a bit, right? And then that's how you can create solutions for the future. Okay.
Just as an intervention on this one, because of something which Joel said, and I think what's really interesting here is the abiding idea of the community ball, your ball analogy. I'm following you that, nothing more than that. But it's the community idea. Whether we look at it in terms of the way that private properties nowadays, malls, commercial buildings, all of them have this very distinct requirement of having a community space, whether it is created through cafes, F&B, or it is created through flexible spaces, plazas, which we see. Or if we go back to the very simple example of community space, there is an ubiquitous community space which we've grown up with without even realizing it. It's called the void deck. We have lived with it for many decades, but this underlying principle of the community space, which binds together that question of social cohesion and harmony, but also binds the question of socioeconomic interactions across different types of typologies, is something which has been a unique part of the DNA of Singapore planning, right? In terms of we've justified it very often by saying, oh, we don't have space otherwise, so we need to do all of these things to be able to maximize it. But actually that is not true. That is just the veil behind the socio-political agenda of creating accessible, inclusive spaces which will at least capture as much as possible the diversity of our communities.
Okay, thanks. Looking at the time, we are about to reach the end. Actually, we have already. So I really appreciate a lot of comments being raised here, being like big, broader concept like inclusivity, some solutions to be offered requiring multiple parties to work together. And also this ideal of bringing workplace and then consumption amenities together so we can better enjoy workplace, offering small solutions, concrete solutions, for example, for SMU to set up a childcare facility. It's as simple as that, right? Trust me, being a mother of 3, I completely relate. Okay, something I've been thinking for quite some time. So these are very concrete ideas we have put on the table. And now let's open up the floor for questions because you guys are a big part of tonight's events. We want to hear your voices as well.
I'll go for it first only because you used the word gentrification, and that's, of course, a theoretical frame. I think one of the things which we need to think carefully about here before we use the language of gentrification and the vocabulary of gentrification is to first understand what we mean by gentrification. Gentrification is not something which is led by planners. Gentrification is something which is led by the market. And it is something which is the yuppieization of an area, right? You see this happening, and this was in the 80s and 90s when I had hair. It happened at a time where people, the young and up and coming, were entering into places which were otherwise poor social housing and taking over them and bringing vitality to them. I've just come back from the US. And you know how you know you're in a yuppie area, in a gentrified area? How close you are to Trader Joe's. For those of you who go to the US, you know this. If you're in the West Coast, actually any part of the US, if you are near a Trader Joe's, it's a gentrified area. In the UK, if Marks and Spencer has come to you, civilization has arrived. This is the way in which we look at gentrification. But this is where it's market-led. Market-led specifically not by a consortium, but led by small little individuals who then start building it up. And afterward, one of the questions which I will reverse back to you is, have you ever heard of reverse gentrification? It's called the moment when you've jumped the shark. When you've jumped the shark, and in Singapore, where has this happened? Tiong Bahru. Tiong Bahru, in what used to be the pristine, beautiful living of the walk-up 1950s Singapore Improvement Trust houses, wow, great and good, over 1 million. Now everybody's like, well, I want to sell out already because it doesn't carry with it the same amenities which used to attract people there now. The yuppies have moved out of that area. Jump the shark. So this is where we need to think through about what it means to adopt gentrification first. But along your line of that, uneven development doesn't really occur in the stages which we look at in terms of Singapore, very much because of the diversified and decentralized nature of employment as well. If you look at the issues of uneven development which happen in other countries, in other cities, it is because not only is low-level housing, and I give you the case in point, London prior to the before 2012 Olympics. How do we know that you lived in a terrible area? You lived south of the river. Why was it south of the river? Because Battersea Power Station blew all its emissions into the south and you were in the armpit of London. You basically dealt with all the smog which came out. That meant that not only were you living in poor conditions, you were working in poor conditions as well. And so this is where we need to be much more critical in the way that we engage with uneven development and what it means in the urban form itself. So great question down there. And it's really good that you asked that question exactly because gentrification is a word which comes up very often the moment we think through the emergence of gated communities. We think suddenly that area is going to become gentrified. And the answer is not always the case. Something to think about.
All right, I see. Thank you very much. Sorry. I see a lot of questions coming up on the slide. I'm losing sight of the previous questions. Maybe we can start from the most fresh ones. So the first question on the list, okay, we have seen issues on business parks and small plot office buildings in Singapore, given the low efficiency for fewer density of workers. So what would be your suggestion for urban planners to solve this? Whoever would like to take this question.
If I fail, then you take over, okay? Wow, this one. I think that no secret to which business parks now are struggling, right? Changi Business Park, in fact, struggling so much that even Bloomberg reported. Just a tip, but when Bloomberg starts reporting, right, it's the end already, right? One of the things that there's two parts. There's two parts to this part, how to make a successful sorry, I lost the question. The third one, yeah. Okay. It's a lot about renewal. Okay. When economic cycle, you see how Singapore is once again, using Singapore as the example, you see how we have moved from manufacturing, right? Throughout the 60s, the 70s, then after that, we started to move to higher value manufacturing. Then after that, now, as other countries caught up, then we start moving to services. And then now we're trying to move to even higher value AI, right? Machining and all that. We keep evolving. We keep trying to upgrade the spaces. And at one point of time, using Changi Business Park, actually at one point in time, Changi Business Park was very successful. Why? Because it was essentially the back office, right? The back and middle office for a lot of these banks and so on. And that was very successful pretty much from the early 2000s all the way to the mid 5-6 years ago, right? And of course, as we know, in the last 5, 6, 7 years, a lot of the banks started moving the operations to India, Philippines, and so on, right? For these so-called lower value services, right? Where they can do it for cheaper. In the end, right, it's a lot about, and that also partly explains why JTC and a lot of the land is actually from the JTC side. This is the reason why they give 30 plus 30, right? 60 years. And simply because why they do 30 plus 30 is simple. It's because they want you to inject more capital after the 30 years is up, right? So that you can regenerate in order to keep the next 30 to 60 years, right? And then you upgrade your product according to time. So probably this is, unfortunately, all these things don't happen overnight. That's the reality of it. And meanwhile, we have to bear with, half empty, unsightly buildings. And then, a lot of times the developers, unfortunately, or the landlords have to have to warehouse some of these underperforming assets on the balance sheet. But this is part and parcel of, the real estate regeneration process.
Maybe I add on to Joel's point quickly. I think this is really an economic cycle, really where we see certain use cases over time is no longer really relevant because of how business have restructured and how technology has changed the way of working. So I think the key part here is also from an urban planner point of view is maybe don't control so much. Now, it's kind of, urban planners usually they want a lot of control, but sometimes by creating that flexibility, right, you actually make it easier. That being said, there's always the capital markets part when you have some small owners that own small office. They don't really care because they got it cheap. They still get a cheaper rental. So to them, they won't make any changes. But sometimes, interestingly, you also see these buildings get a life of their own. I always remember the piece mentioned, before, they got en bloc. Then they got en bloc. Then they do a lot of funky things about it. Then suddenly the place feels very alive. And sometimes you think about it is, do we control too much? Do we actually provide, give the owners back to the markets to let them adapt even faster? That's my take.
Just an intervention on this
yeah.
one, Jing, about business parks. I think one of the interesting things which we need to think about in terms of business parks and clusters has been the two signature ones which we know, of course, IBP and CBP, far-flung, not exactly connected with anything. Have any of you been to IBP and tried to take the MRT to it? Your walk, how far is the walk? And then if you miss the shuttle, and then even when you take the shuttle, 15, 20 minutes, and then you xiao liao. That's the problem about it, right? So this is where we need to ask ourselves about the connectivity of these business parks itself, right? They become no man's land after work is done. That's the first issue around it. And so I'm just going to speed forward. What would my suggestion be? We are going to start thinking through already the rejuvenation of public housing estates. And we're going to start thinking through en bloc. We're going to open up new plots, which would be for rehousing these people whom we are unsettled, moving out while we develop that. Instead of having that plot devoted to just HDB, why can't we let that small precinct become a mini BP, a mini cluster, for people to have employment over there, acting as a small cluster and having multiple satellite small clusters, which already run on the established MRT connectivity. And furthermore, the second part, which I think is important, and for people who work in business parks, you will know this, the variety of amenities which are available to you around there, which means having hawker centers, coffee shops, having retail, the supermarket, having childcare, which is possible over there as well. All these existing infrastructure already, which the commercial developer doesn't need to actually engage in and invest in. This would, I think, be the question. How do we transform ownership of what is owned by HDB now over to JTC, saying that this is how we're going to redevelop it in a more decentralized employment system, right? Employment site system.
Okay. I think the first thing is don't learn from Singapore. and that is wherever I met with the Malaysian government officials or Thai, they asked me, oh, what should we do? What can we learn from Singapore? I said, the thing about Singapore, right, that you need to learn is don't learn from Singapore, but learn about your country first. Yeah, and if you think about all these cities, right, actually they have their culture, they have their history, very rich history. The key part is how do you accentuate that history? How do you make it alive? How do you let the people who stay there identify? I think that is something missing. So, I mean, we came from the era that we learned from the UK system, we learned from the US system. But I think at this point in time, it's more critical to learn from what your country, your community, what they actually need. I think that is the gap there.
Do you have anything to add? Otherwise.
I think the main issue around placemaking is first trying to identify, and this goes around with Nai Jia's point, what is the identity of your city? What is the identity of your country? Where do we stand in trying to both internalize and exhibit what the identity is? In Singapore, we have had this ongoing question for 60 years. Yes, if I were to ask any one of you, what is the Singapore identity? You'll be a bit like, Exactly because it's a work in progress. And it's only made more challenging exactly because of the openness, porosity, mobility, complexity, and diversity which we deal with in terms of our communities which make up the Singapore community. Similarly, cities like Cairo and Nusantara in the future, particularly if they are aiming towards global city status, cannot just be running on a domestic population and giving themselves just this indigenous feel, because it is that same type of challenge which they will encounter, particularly as they change their orientation to one which is much more global. Then comes the question of what I call the stock and flow problem. The stock are the people who are resident. The flow are the ones who come in and out, they traverse and they transform, they change. If we look at the stock, how have we created the platforms, both intangible and tangible, for them to feel as though they have done a Neil Armstrong in planting their flag and their ownership in that land? How many times have we done that? Think through the small efforts we've done in Singapore. We transformed our HDBs from being painted in a certain way to now you get to vote what color you want. Sometimes leftover colors from ICI Dulux. On the other hand, you get to have the choice of having murals painted by school children from the nearby schools, shaping the identity of your HDB estates. We see the emergence of murals and so release and more innovation of creative art, graffiti in any other language, as a means of creating that sense of community. But what else do we need to do? There has to be the intangible, which not only serves as the conduit for further growth, because these murals are ossified. They are static there. They stand as reminders no different from a statue. But we need to ask ourselves, where next? With that process of placemaking, with that process of community building.
Okay, maybe I just chip in on the last bit, before we Prof. Jing brings this to a close. Practically speaking, actually, it's just how much capital you have. The richest countries in the world, right? Actually, they're the most. You think about it, they're the most beautiful places. A simple example is Dubai, right? Just look, it's desert, guys. Money can do a lot of things. And if you take a step back, right, your money needs to come from somewhere, right? Of course, in Dubai, straightforward, it comes from oil, right? In Singapore, what is it? Singapore actually is because and we have really had to thank our previous generations, who have saved a lot of money. The local banks are very well funded. They don't have to rely on external financing. And because of that, the cost of borrowing is affordable, right? Very similar to Japan, right? And because of, it's not really, maybe this is not something that well known by SMU, but if you look at the bank's balance sheets, a very significant amount of the bank's balance sheet is actually construction and real estate loans. Very significant, right? And that's how you make a city, right? In line with, what, Nai Jia and Aidan have shared. And those are the soft elements that make it successful. And you bring in that capital and you get, well, we're right in it, aren't we? Yeah. So that's my take.
All right, thank you very much. I hope these are very comprehensive view for you to take away. Essentially, right, you need to look inside, look internally, identify potential challenges like what we discussed earlier today for Singapore. And then maybe at a time when you were trying to form up a solution and you can look externally, if it is short of a capital, for example, then maybe come up with a way and then borrow some lessons from Singapore. Let me thank all the panelists for taking the valuable time and thank everybody for being here tonight. Okay, thanks.